Hi, Ethan.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing well. It's a warm October day here.
It's a warm October day here. Isn't that a coincidence? We must both be on the eastern seaboard.
Sounds like it.
Neither of us terribly far from New York. You're in New York, right?
I am. I'm at the Shambala Center here in
The
Manhattan.
Shambala Center, which leads directly to why I'm talking to you. You're a Buddhist, and you
I
published
am.
this. You've written this cool book, The Dharma of the Princess Bride. Subtitle. In fact, the book is so cool. The subtitle has the word, a form of the word "cool" in it. What the coolest fairy tale of our time can teach us about Buddhism and relationships, and we're going to talk about this. It's published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. People may or may not understand what a prestigious thing that is. Farrar Straus is a very literary house, one of the few houses that still does poetry, in fact. And so you should be honored to have the. It's North Point, strictly speaking, but that's part of FSG, right?
Yes, I haven't quite figured out exactly how imprints work at a house. I don't. You could maybe school me on that, but it's North Point Press for our FSG books, and
Yeah.
yeah, this is my second book with them, so I feel doubly prestigious. And yeah, definitely know it's been a great experience working with them.
You look doubly prestigious. You're wearing a tie.
I know we do. Sometimes in Shambhala we do that. I used to teach a course on Introduction to Buddhist Meditation and Philosophy at Eugene Lang College at New School when I was a younger person, and I developed this look as what I like to call my shabby chic professor look.
It's working. It's working. I'm feeling like a lot of respectful things. So where should we start? Now, a lot of people may have seen this movie, but we shouldn't assume that. Before we start talking about the movie, say a little bit about its plot and its cultural significance, and then get into your take on it from a Buddhist perspective. Why don't we talk a little bit about how it entered your life? And that story begins with the fact that you are a so-called Dharma brat. Is that right, a Dharma brat? That's a play on Army brat, I take it?
I think so. I don't know who came up with it, but
Because
that's
I'm an actual Army brat.
yeah.
But I don't resent your co-opting our terminology at all.
I didn't make it up. I just got called it a bunch,
Okay.
and then you reflect back your culture. So Dharma brat. In my case, I was a child of two students of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the Tibetan Buddhist Lama who came to the West in the 1960s, and then North America in 1970, and founder of the Shambhala tradition. And so my parents were both Buddhist people, and growing up Buddhist, I guess you're called a Dharma brat.
Right. And I want to, after we've talked about your book a while, I hope to talk a little about Shambhala and maybe a little bit about Trungpa Rinpoche, who is a very interesting figure. So when you saw this movie, you were what? You were like 8 years old, and it was kind of a traumatic moment in your life?
I was 9, so it's 30 years ago. We're right around the 30th anniversary of the film's release. I was in 4th grade. Let's see, what was going on? I had 2 surgeries that year. My best friend had skipped ahead without me, so I wasn't very cool. Chögyam Trungpa had died that year.
And he was your father. Again, both of your parents, teacher. Which is a
Teacher.
very serious thing. It's not just teacher like you had him in college. It's like their central spiritual guide.
Yeah, and especially, I think he had a group of hundreds or a few thousand students who he really connected with, and with a real sense of devotion and loyalty, and so that was a big. And he died early on in a typical life. So, and then my parents went through a pretty difficult divorce and separation. That year, so that's always interesting when 2 Buddhist people fight with each other, and then my grandfather and his wife, my step grandmother, committed suicide together. So all of that happened in a year span, and during that year span, I saw in the fall a movie that my father's. The reason I saw the movie was because my father's childhood best friend, the actor Christopher Guest, they had grown up together. Played a bad guy in the movie, so my dad invited me to go see it, and which I thought was hilarious that Christopher was playing a bad guy. So that was the sort of initial connection.
One footnote to answer a question that may arise. I gather your grandfather was terminally ill, and your grandmother decided to follow him, and that's how they both wound up committing suicide.
That's right. He had advancing Parkinson's. He was a pediatrician turned psychiatrist, and his wife was actually a little bit older than him, but was healthy. And beautiful moment. Talk about it in the book, and it's recorded as a suicide in the New York Times obituary. So it's very public knowledge. But they went together. Yeah. So.
Okay, so you, I mean, this is interesting that your father was not just friends, but kind of best friends with Christopher Guest, who people may know mainly from the mockumentaries like This Is Spinal Tap, Best in Show, and so on, right?
Yeah, I was rewatching the movie a couple weeks ago with David Gellis of the New York Times because he was writing an article and he wanted to watch the movie together, and I was just marveling at how Christopher Guest's comedic talents are pretty unused in this movie. He's one of the least funny things in this movie.
It's a pretty serious, I mean, everything in the movie is slightly funny, but he doesn't do a lot of comedy, no.
No, he does a little bit, but he's from, Nigel Tufnell from This Is Spinal Tap, and my personal favorite is Corky St. Clair from Waiting for Guffman. So yeah, he might be the godfather of the mockumentary in some way, although Rob Reiner could maybe claim that title as well. So they were best friends growing up. Their mothers were friends before they were born, and to this day, 69 years later, they're still very, very close friends.
Okay. So was your father in kind of theatrical circles, or it was just more or less a coincidence?
My dad's day job has always been, he's a musician and composer, David Nichtern, and he's also been a Buddhist teacher for a long time and meditation teacher. So he kind of goes back. All of his circles are somewhere in music or Dharma, so to speak, and he's in a lot of different circles. He's a kind and social guy.
Okay. So when you saw this movie, you had been exposed to Buddhism in a way that most 9-year-olds hadn't. Were you at that moment very into it?
No, I think the next year, which would have been like 1988, I took my first class in meditation, which at the what was called then the New York Dharma Dhatu, now the Shambala Center, and Eric Spiegel, who's still a friend and mentor to this day, taught about like 6 or 7 like kids, and I remember feeling bad because I had asthma, and the girl behind me kept telling me I was breathing too loud, and I remember being very.
I laugh, but when you're 9, that kind of thing can really be traumatic.
Yeah. No. It's sweet and funny, and I wouldn't bring it up if it still was.
If it was still haunting you, you don't wake up at night thinking about that.
No. And I like when people cut me down to size these days. So, but it was boring. But I also remember feeling like some kind of interesting connection to my mind, and then did a little bit of meditation in high school. I read, I was really into reading books, read Thich Nhat Hanh, read Chögyam Trungpa, read Suzuki Roshi, was really into just the philosophy of Buddhism, and was doing some meditation, and really got into it in college, was when I really, I developed a regular meditation practice near the end of high school, but as I joke in my book, it was the first time I got dumped in college. That's when I knew I was a Buddhist.
You felt dukkha.
Yeah, and also some kind of tenderness and sadness towards myself. But yeah, there was a sense of not being able to have what I thought I wanted that led to a real realization of some kind.
Yeah, and you already knew enough about Buddhism to probably have a sense for what an apt practice it would be to resume at that moment. Yeah,
and also, felt all the social pressures of like what makes a person unique in a progressive institution. So I'm sure there was some sort of like, if I return to really identifying as Buddhist, that could be my thing. So identifying with a non-identity.
Okay, yeah, these are among the paradoxes that Buddhism can present us with. So you're now a senior teacher in the Shambhala tradition in New York. Now, Dharma, I guess almost nobody needs that spelled out, but for these purposes, the word Dharma in the title of your book, the Buddhist teachings, more or less, is that the way? Will that do?
Well, I mean, you as a scholar might know at least as much about this as I do, but my understanding,
but go ahead.
the Sanskrit term dharma really just refers to any collected body of spiritual teachings. So it also refers to the Buddha's teachings, and then it has this other meaning in the Sanskrit of a momentary phenomenon, kind of the atomistic aspect of subjective perception. But here it means the sort of body of teachings that come from loving the Princess Bride, specifically around relationships. So that's really what I was going for here. Is I wanted to, coming out of my last book, which is an modern overview of the Shambala Buddhist teachings, the Road Home, I really wanted to talk about relationships more, which is such a tricky topic for modern spiritual practitioners and Buddhists. And we think there's some big secret that we're supposed to know about it. But I wanted to be able to talk about it in a more cultural and playful way, and in a way that could allow me to be a little bit more personal with the topic. So the Dharma of the Princess Bride is the collected teachings of trying to be mindful in relationships coming from the Princess Bride.
Right. And you say there are basically three categories of teachings here: family, romance, and friendship, right? And we'll get to all those. Let's start out by talking about the whole idea of a kind of a Dharma movie. That's a term you hear in Buddhist circles, meaning a movie that in some sense or another reflects, Buddhist ideas or whatever. Is this well known? Is The Princess Bride well known as a Dharma movie?
No, I would say, I mean, obviously in your great recent book, Why Buddhism is True, which I hope your own audience has read, but if they haven't,
I wouldn't count on it.
You talk about the Matrix as being this sort of central one, which Matrix is definitely, at least the first one. I do mention the Matrix in the introduction of my book. I would say that the Matrix, and I would say that the other one that everybody talks about, I don't know if in your circles this is true, is Groundhog Day, the Bill Murray movie. That those are the two that people really talk about.
I'm not sure I've heard that, but it makes a lot of sense. That would be worth thinking about. Maybe that should be your next book. You could definitely spend a book on that. The Princess Bride, not famous as, of course, in the Matrix, the Buddhist idea is that the reality we perceive is not necessarily the real thing. A big part of Buddhism is we have a kind of misleading view of the world, to put it mildly, and piercing the illusion is the path to liberation, which is the basic idea in the Matrix. Now, even though this doesn't have, as you say, a big reputation as a Dharma movie, even before we get into the plot, there's something interesting about the movie, which it's not just a fairy tale. It's like a meta fairy tale. There is consciousness in the movie that it's just a fairy tale, right? Because it starts, I think it's the very beginning, where Peter Falk is this grandfather reading the story to his son, and his grandson. We don't see that much of them, but it's the framing of the thing, right?
Right. So there's two aspects there. So again, one of the themes that I introduced in the introduction is the notion that pop culture has become our spiritual text, that any spiritual life is actually lived in a cultural context, and the popular narratives of that culture are really going to influence the spiritual life. So, there are certain narratives and certain ways that, for example, the life of the Buddha is told as a story, that it's a very structured narrative. I joked with it could be a sort of Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey is one way of looking at that, sort of this solitary hero conquering all. I joked with a friend who's a psychotherapist, like maybe this is the story of awakening for somebody with an avoidant attachment style, who has to leave the world behind, so there's a certain frame in the stories that we hear that give us a sense of who we are. And so it's just, on one hand, what I'm saying in this book is this is the story that's guided me, but I do think there's something very dharmic about it. One, that it's a story that talks about the transmission of a story, which is the notion of lineage, is that we're passing something along, and it's in that act of transmission that you actually establish a human lineage. And so that's why I do think, and Rob Reiner actually said this, that the whole point of the movie is this relationship between the grandfather and the grandson. But the other thing, and I think this gets into the notion of narrative and the real world versus the fantasy world, which I think, even though they're completely different, you could draw some connection with Matrix, is the notion of this being a postmodern narrative and a deconstruction. So it takes the fairy tale genre and it totally makes fun of it, and it totally undercuts it. And what I would argue in our contemporary era, I would say another deconstructed sort of fantasy narrative is Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones doesn't do a lot of what a classic fairy tale thinks you want it to do, at least not so far. And but Princess Bride specifically is taking a classic sort of rom-com, like saccharine sweet fairy tale, and just all the characters are weird, awkward send-ups of those characters.
Now, yeah, and you call it a parody, I think, of a fairy tale. I think that's the term you use, or either that or satire. But for people who haven't seen it, it's not as extreme a parody as like Monty Python would have done with it. There's just kind of a consistent texture of sometimes mild irony, right? It's like that's what's interesting about it. It's not very often over the top. There are definitely things where you go, that's a joke, but yeah. It's an interesting texture.
Yes, it is an interesting texture, and it deconstructs a genre and it stays true to the genre at the same time, which is a very, very beautiful and rare balance. And but I also think, in terms of its deconstruction, a lot of times when things get deconstructed, it has a kind of skeptical air to it, a kind of hipster irony to it. And this is what I would call an optimistic deconstruction. It's a deconstruction of a genre that beginning, middle, and end, the point is true love, and true love in a romantic sense, but really more importantly, true love in a familial and lineage sense. And so that's what I argue Buddhism is an optimistic deconstruction of a narrative.
Let's focus on that. Buddha, in what sense is Buddhism an optimistic? I think I know what you mean, but why don't you spell it out for everyone? An optimistic deconstruction of what narrative?
Of whatever narrative we're stuck in, or whatever narrative we inherit, and you obviously frame that through, in your work through evolutionary, that we inherit kind of through genetic processes a certain narrative, but we could also look at it from a psychodynamic standpoint or a cultural standpoint. So we have certain stories, and in this case, you could say we have certain stories about the way love goes. And you want to, one of the central notions of Buddhism is that you have to liberate yourself from stuck modes of thinking and perceiving. But the notion is that we're doing that, and I think this is what Buddhism is all about, we're doing that to feel actually more connected to ourselves and to other beings. So that's the optimistic part. That's the part that's about love. So we're not doing it to grow more cynical.
So we go through life with stories. They may be, they're often, a lot of our stories pertain to us in one sense or another. Sometimes they're unduly negative stories about ourselves, you might say, and sometimes they might be flattering stories about ourselves. But we humans tend to impose stories on things. They don't just sit there and, they don't just look at a person and go, okay, that's a hair follicle, there's another hair follicle. They start building a narrative about the people and the things they see, including themselves. And Buddhism is about cutting through that.
Right.
But not in a nihilistic way, ultimately, You're saying.
Well, and I think a lot of times it is viewed as another form of nihilism. Yeah. And I think it's really important that there is a kind of the point, so to speak, of liberation, at least from the standpoint of the traditions that I've studied, and it's in some of the traditions this point is made more implicitly, and some it's made more explicitly, but that then you are a being who's actually available to the present moment, which means you can actually be a helpful sentient being to yourself and others, right, and a kind and compassionate one. So there's a sense of a liberation from a story for the purpose of being more available rather than more cynical.
Right. A lot of our stories are about the past or the future, and in fact, they've shown that when the mind is just wandering, you're walking along, not doing anything particular. Your mind's just wandering from thought to thought. Most of the thoughts actually are about the past or the future. A majority of them are, and so they keep you from being engaged with the present, including engaged with people you're actually talking to sometimes.
Right.
So, you think maybe you should give people your 30-second or 40-second plot summary, just in case. Actually, before we do that, let's set the cultural moment. So this is in the 80s. The movie came out in 87, and I wasn't aware maybe before your book came out of how much of a cult classic it is among a certain audience. It was definitely a movie to be noticed because I was living in New York in the 80s, and it was like my wife and I went to see it. It was a movie you would go see, and we didn't go see a lot of movies. So it was one of the movies you were supposed to see. And I remember liking it. And then that's kind of the main thing I remember. But culturally, within a certain group, it really had more valence than that, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think, we're living in this moment where the 1980s, maybe it's just because that's whatever generation then comes into some kind of status or some kind of like economic power, the nostalgia of that generation then becomes sort of centralized. That's quite possible. But we're definitely living in this moment where the 1980s are kind of the core nostalgia, I would say. And, the interesting thing about this movie is it's the movie that, according to the stories, nobody thought could be made into a movie because it was a book by a very well-known Hollywood screenwriter, William Goldman.
Which is shocking. I mean, he's the one who did Lord of the Flies, right?
That's William Golding.
Okay.
Yeah, he did things like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Okay. There, that solves that. I mean, I was like, this guy had a dimension I had not thought about, but now that it makes a lot more sense with Butch Cassidy than with Lord of the Flies. Okay.
So, but this was Rob Reiner says this was his favorite book, but nobody thought you could make it into a successful movie because there's too many asides. It's too playful. There's a lot of sort of, narrating and parentheticals, and it just doesn't kind of make sense. So because Rob Reiner had such success recently with this Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, they let him make this movie, and it was kind of a low budget, movie, and it didn't. I think it seems like they didn't quite know how to promote it, and my understanding is it was 41st at the box office in 1987. So now, I think 2015, 2016, the statistical website 538.com does a list, a survey of the 25 most rewatchable movies of all time, and it's number 6, and it's up there. I mean, it's beyond cult classic. It's the league that Princess Bride is in is like The Sound of Music and the Star Wars trilogy and Lord of the Rings and Gone with the Wind. That's where people put this. So I think there is something, because it is a fairy tale, but it's also an ironic fairy tale. Mm-hmm. It speaks to the certain generation that came of age. It's a kind of a meme factory in terms of one-liners. So something about the way memory works allows it to be etched further and further. And it might, to some degree, be with the rise of so-called hipsterdom and that sense of irony, that this becomes kind of like the soft heart of hipsterdom, and that's why it's so popular. But I don't know. I mean, it definitely had sort of a cumulative nostalgia effect on me. It was much more in my 20s and 30s that it became more and more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now for your 30-second plot summary. First of all, well-known actors, right? Mandy Patinkin, Wallace Shawn. The first big screen appearance of Robin Wright, who's now familiar from House of Cards and many other things, and others. I'm sure Christopher Guest we mentioned, and others. Yeah. So
Andre the Giant.
Andre the Giant, very memorable character. So tell people what happens.
Yeah, so it's basically the movie plot is a grandfather arriving somewhere in suburban Chicago to comfort his grandson, who's about 9, 10, 11, Fred Savage, on a sick day home from school, and he reads him this fairy tale that his father read to him, and he's going to read it now to his grandson, and it's. At first, Fred Savage, the grandson's not that into it. He's kind of bratty. He wants to play his video game. That all sounds very familiar to me at that time. and gets into this fairy tale. And the fairy tale is basically about a farm boy and who's sort of a serf for this girl's family, who's Buttercup, who wants to marry her but has to go across the seas to make his fortune. He goes across the seas. His ship gets attacked by pirates. He's presumed dead. Fast forward 5 years, Buttercup has now left him behind because she thinks he's dead. She's a beautiful young, she's well suited for the prince, who is this very vain character called Prince Humperdinck, rhymes with Trumperdinck. He wants to marry her, but really only wants to marry her for a plot where he can declare war on a neighboring country. So there's some mercenaries who are hired to kidnap and then kill her, but they are interceded by this mysterious man in black, this pirate character who's like a ninja, who's ambidextrous with fencing. He bests all of the mercenaries in combat, gets his Buttercup back. And at this point,
I would remind our viewers that we're not sure that the farm boy is actually dead.
Right.
Hasn't been documented.
Yeah, so at a certain point, he unmasks, and then they have to go through an ordeal called the fire swamp. Right. So there's lots of obstacles, funny obstacles. That's one of the ways I think that the movie becomes a joke. Like there's the names for the obstacles and the settings of the obstacles are just kind of completely ridiculous.
So there are these kind of allegorical sounding names. I mean, there's the Cliff of Despair. Oh no, the Cliff of
Pit of Despair. Cliffs of Insanity.
Cliffs of Insanity. The Pit of Despair.
Yeah. Okay. So that's allegorical. The fire swamp.
Right.
Rodents of unusual size, or RUS. There's a thing called snow sand, which looks like quicksand, which I think there's some great stand-up comedians who've done stand-ups about the quicksand scene. So there's a lot of sort of allegorical obstacles that playfully can map onto a meditator's issue with their own mind, I would say.
Well, why don't you mention one of them? Why don't you elaborate a little? Just pick an example of how this might connect with meditation.
Sure. I mean, I think the Cliffs of Insanity, this notion of hauling, you feel like you're hauling multiple people up this unending cliff.
You mean when you're meditating, or that's what you meditate to overcome, or what?
I think a meditation session can sometimes feel like you're like sort of trying to surge forward against gravity with all these voices in your head. Mm-hmm. And then, the rodents of
we should say, Andre the Giant is like trying to climb the cliff, and he's got like 2 or 3 people hanging on to him, right? His job is to climb with them yelling in his ear.
And that becomes even more interesting because Andre the Giant had, major back problems, was supposedly in a brace the whole time the movie was
right?
being... Yeah. That was... yeah. So, I think, again, so then they have to, basically Wesley gets recaptured by the evil Prince Humperdinck.
He's the farm boy, right?
Yes, Wesley.
Who had reappeared in the guise of this pirate with the mask.
Yes, he's holding this warrior lineage, of the Dread Pirate Roberts, which is a whole nother interesting guru narrative, I think, could be drawn from that. And then he basically has to be saved by Inigo Montoya and Fezzik, Andre the Giant, and Mandy Patinkin, because Inigo Montoya needs to claim revenge against the Six-Fingered Man. There's some interesting battle scenes, and they do end up, the 3 friends and Buttercup do end up making it away. And the key refrain, the really key part of this movie, is then when it comes back to the grandfather and grandson, the phrase of devotion that Wesley always said to his true love Buttercup, which is a hilarious undercutting of our ability to idealize romantic love in the name Buttercup. But Wesley would always say, "as you wish," to any of her demands, which would be representational of devotion and true love. And at the end, the grandson asks his grandfather to come back and read the story again tomorrow. And the grandfather says, "as you wish." So
I actually didn't notice that.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole point of the movie, is that line. So you should.
Well, it's not the first movie whose whole point has escaped me. So say a little more about that though. Is the idea that this is a fairy tale and that as you wish, of course, is not going to be a reliably fulfilled like thing in your life. Is that just a comment on the actual nature of romance, which is the context, or does it have broader application to what Buddhism says about life, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do, there are a lot of places in Buddhist thought where this comes up. I really wanted to explore alongside this some Buddhist ideas of why supportive friendships are helpful to the path, or how we can sort of undercut myths about romance, how we can deal with our family. You know, I've had countless conversations, you know, with myself and others about, you know, going from a deep meditation retreat to just a really hard time dealing with one's relatives or one's close relationships. So, you know, I think As You Wish represents a quality of commitment and devotion to our path, but also to the relationships that make our human life worthwhile. And I think I wanted to get out of this sort of what I think has become a sort of popular, more libertarian Buddhist narrative in the West, that like meditation is this thing you do when you commit to just being fully alone with yourself. You shut out other people, and you only kind of, you don't have to be worry about your relationships, and really look at it as meditation as being an act of working with your own mind, because nobody else can do that for us, but in a supportive environment of actually trying to be a compassionate person in relationships. So to me, As You Wish it could represent devotion to a teacher that we connect with. It could represent a trusting friendship. It could represent devotion to our own, you know, true self, which is not the most Buddhist way of saying that, at least not in the English
Not
language.
Exactly.
Well, depends how you define
Although,
it.
you know, I know you've got this interesting thing, and maybe this connects to Shambhala. This idea that the Buddhist idea of not self, which is often taken as a metaphysical claim that the self doesn't exist, that could be thought of as just meaning be your authentic self, right? Mm-hmm. Now, elaborate on that, because it's not obvious what that would mean, I think, or how those two would actually align.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I want to say is just that a lot of these, we're working with these terms in English, and these terms, as they come to us from Pali, the earliest language of Buddhism, or Sanskrit, the later academic language, or Tibetan, or whatever the language is, these terms all had a context and an experiential context. So, you know, Atta or Atman, that term that we're translating as self, that may not be the best translation, right? It has a context coming from my understanding from the Vedic and Hindu tradition. It really means something more like soul, like center of the self that's solid, that's permanent, that's never changing. Whereas if you just take self to mean instead, and I think a lot of people in English view it more this way, that it's your sense of conscious, it's your sense of being a being who is connected to but distinct from other beings, which we each are, then annihilating that is not necessarily the healthiest way to go. That's not annihilating our humanity, if that's what we mean by self, is not really what Buddhism is talking about. It's undercutting and dissolving a myth that there's some solid centrality to our being. So then you do talk, like when you get into the Shambhala teachings, they do talk about things like authentic presence as being a manifestation of one's awakening, that you actually are completely interwoven with your environment, with your cultural moment. So, you know, is it self-identity, for example? I talked about this in my last book, The Road Home, that I love the band Radiohead. You know, is that something I'm fixating on as an Atman, or is that just me connecting with my time and place as a practitioner? You know, it's
Of course, I mean, in the more traditional conception of not self, the interconnectedness is taken almost as part of the argument for not self. In other words, we're so finely intertwined with the environment and other people that where exactly the bounds of the self are, you know, or how solid they are falls into question. So these are really interesting issues, but I take your point. I mean, look, the Sangha, the community, is a fundamental emphasis in Buddhism. So it's certainly, although people think of meditating as a solitary activity, there's certainly a big emphasis on relationship to other beings, and of course, concern for the welfare of all sentient beings. So it's not so libertarian. Yeah, it does not strike me as a natural interpretation of Buddhism. I'm interested that I hadn't heard this idea that there is now a kind of libertarian interpretation of Buddhism. I mean, do you see that coming out of Silicon Valley or something, or?
I see it as perhaps, and I'm not enough familiar with either ancient or modern Asian culture to say this, but there is. I do think we are having this conversation in a cultural and political environment that you and I live in, perhaps the most individualistic society that's ever existed on Earth, that being the 2017 United States of America. And we have perhaps the most individualistic leader that any country has ever had. So that's going to influence our narrative quite a bit about what our spiritual path is supposed to look like. So obviously there's a journey of solitude. Obviously nobody else can do our so-called practice for us or any of our work for us. But I also think, here's a simple logical twist. If what the Buddha realized in non-self was that he was completely interwoven with everything else, then when he attained awakening, everyone else would attain awakening too. So there is some distinct, I like in the Indian middle way school of philosophy, the Madhyamaka school of philosophy, which is a very deep and entrenched philosophical system that had many iterations throughout India and Japan and Tibet. This notion that the self is not one and not two. In other words, that you can't say that we are separate individuals, and you also can't say that there's not a distinct being going on. So we are interconnected. We aren't the same. It's not like all one.
Okay. So I promised that we would cover the three categories you emphasize in the book: family, friendship, and romance. We've kind of touched a little on family and romance, but you may want to say more about those. And in any event, I just want you to have the opportunity to give us some kind of key takeaways from your point of view that fall in those three categories.
Yeah, I mean the key takeaways of the friendship part, which is, again, so each section of the book interweaves me trying to be transparent about my own journey with these things as a Buddhist practitioner, with some Buddhist ideas that have been relevant to me, with loving the narrative of and the relationships and themes in The Princess Bride. So it's an interesting little mashup or sampling there. In the friendship part, I would say that the key takeaway is this notion that it's exactly what we've been talking about, that actually thinking about friendship as a practice and supportive friendship relationships as a way to actually help our path and also help conquer the so-called bad guys of our confused habitual tendencies. That's, I would say, the key takeaway, that we actually gain a lot from thinking about friendship as a practice as much as we think about our solitary path as a practice. The key takeaway from the romance section, I would say, the last chapter of that section is about partnership and marriage. But I would say that the key takeaway is really framing and sort of really trying to get in decoding what does Buddhism actually say about desire for another person, both as problematic and also what about desire as an developing greater empathy, compassion, and actually opening us up to a larger universe. So, because I think desire is often made a very, very, it's looked at very negatively in a lot of spiritual traditions and a lot of psychological traditions. And the tradition that I come from, I think, sometimes looks at it that way, but I think it's really important to look at our core emotions as human, as not fundamentally flawed, even if we misunderstand them a lot of the time. So really making friends with desire, I would say, is the key takeaway in that middle section. And then the family section, I think, is really acknowledging, and this is a quote from Chögyam Trungpa, that he said, it's possible you could become enlightened everywhere except around your family. So acknowledging that often those who are genetically and in terms of our story and our upbringing the closest to us often actually are the hardest ones to treat with any of the principles that this path is about: mindfulness, compassion, awareness, etc. And actually just giving ourselves permission to practice forgiveness and practice slowly integrating family and our lineage into our spiritual path.
Okay. Now, your audio cut out a little bit when you were talking about romance and desire. So, and I think that's worth drilling more deeply into anyway, because as you say, I mean, desire is treated skeptically in a number of spiritual traditions, and depending on how you translate certain Buddhist terms into English, it's treated skeptically in Buddhism. I mean, so for example, I mean, there's this term tanha, which is typically translated as craving or thirst, and that was at the core of the Buddha's diagnosis of the whole problem. It's a certain way of desiring things with a certain kind of attachment and clinging that he thought was not wholesome, and the and of course that can be part of romance, but you're making a distinction, I gather, between kind of one interpretation of desire and another in a certain sense. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, if you go into the sutta, it's interesting what he says when and in really poor translations of the second noble truth, it will just say the cause of suffering is attachment, right? Which the reason that that's problematic is attachment could, in English, could just mean that two things are related and connected to each other. Mm-hmm. You know, like the way a mother is attached to their child just because they rely on one another in a certain type of relationship. Or, you know, so tanha, the most literal translations I've heard are also are thirst or craving, as you've said, and it's kind of a fixated thirst. You know, it's not just like a longing or a like, ooh, that's beautiful, or ooh, that seems meaningful to me. There's a fixation, there's a stuckness.
Gotta have it.
And in that sutta, he says that tanha, the problematic tanha, has three aspects. One is that there's a real fixated craving on the sense pleasures, you know, which I think you do a really good job in the early phases of Why Buddhism is True, talking about how that actually operates in an evolutionary way. And so there's a fixation that short-term sense pleasures might bring us long-term happiness, right? Mm-hmm. That's a kind of fixated craving. But then what he says more deeply, and I think you have to study the teachings on karma, or the 12 links in the chain of karma, or cause and effect, the 12 nidanas, to really contextualize this, is he says there's a craving for either existence or non-existence. And that to me is really the key, that basically whatever is arising in the present moment, whatever the mind has contacted as an arising, then the confused aspect of the mind either wants to make that experience permanent or annihilate that experience.
Make it go away.
Yeah. Which is, so this is the question I ask: what if the arising in the present moment is desire for another human being? Mm-hmm. Then the cause of suffering could be trying to make that desire go away.
Well, who would do that, though? You mean you can get into trouble trying to be Buddhist in a confused way, or you mean people do this all the time?
People do this all the time. They just feel like, I'm not supposed to be feeling this desire right now. If you add a spiritual dimension to the narrative that says I'm not supposed to be feeling what I'm feeling, then the suppression, the desire to annihilate the feeling can get even stronger. But he clearly says the cause of dissatisfaction, or one of the causes of dissatisfaction, is trying to annihilate the feeling that's arising in the present moment. Now, I think we have a lot of spiritual narratives that make people want to annihilate their own desire.
Yeah. Now, an austere interpretation of Buddhism would confirm that approach, right? I mean, the more intensely Stoic interpretations would say, I mean, as you said, that if the problem is that we cling, or I forget how you put it, but both the existence of things and the non-existence of things is something we're too attached to. Another way of putting that is that, both certain kind of attraction to things and a certain kind of aversion to things is the problem. And there's definitely basis for that in Buddhism. And to bring it back to Princess Bride, I mean, you could say, so really, as you wish is the problem. It's like the problem is always wishing that something that you've got would go away, and something that you don't have would be yours. And the austere...
Yeah, I guess you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, it was one thing that occurred to me. And the austere interpretation, again, would be to say, resist entirely, be this entirely self-sufficient being who can maintain your well-being under the most superficially adverse circumstances, and blah, blah, blah. But you're in favor of a less austere reading.
For sure.
For sure. I'm wondering, is that part of Shambhala, the Shambhala tradition in Buddhism?
I think it's part of the Shambhala tradition. I also think it's part of movements that have existed at various points in Buddhist history that have to get much stronger now, just in terms of the way the world is, that look at the emotions that arise in worldly participation have to be part of the path of awakening, right? That this isn't the Shambhala teachings, which are about societal awakening, have to include the actual things that happen to a person when they participate in society. That was always and I'll just share my personal bias, and I've known a few great monks, and in my own tradition, the Shambhala tradition, the most popular author is a nun, even if that's not the, Pema Chodron,
yeah.
Amazing teacher, even if that's not the majority of practitioners. But for me, this notion that a path of awakening to our own humanity would include a critique of the very act that made us human always felt highly problematic. Mm-hmm. Felt like there was a friction against one's own being that could not lead to being an awakened being. So I'll just share that as my... Now, if we look at the monastic tradition, or the austere tradition, as you call it, as more realizing like an addiction, like there's a period, like a lifelong period of some kind of rehab needed, because the craving cycle and the fixation cycle is so strong that maybe we can't conquer it without really removing ourselves from those actions, then the monastic or the yogic traditions make a lot of sense to me. But the idea that there's a fundamental problem with the love or connection that makes a human being, and then that human being's path is going to lead to being an awakened human being, that doesn't make any logical sense to me.
Okay. Now we said we might mention this interesting figure who kind of founded Shambhala, I guess, Trungpa Rinpoche, and this is a good segue, I think, because he was not exactly constrained. Let's just say his lifestyle does not seem to be an endorsement of an austere interpretation of Buddhism, right?
Right.
And he was controversial for that reason. He drank, sometimes heavily. He had sex, I gather, sometimes with students. I think it's funny. I was just on book tour, and I ran into a few students of his, and none of them made a big deal of that. I think one defense of him is that this was not concealed. He was transparent about all this stuff. Another defense is that, he comes from the Tibetan tradition, and I guess Shambhala is, in a certain sense, his own, I guess, kind of personal synthesis. I mean, he's bringing Tibetan tradition to the United States and creating something a little new. But in any event, the idea is that in the Tibetan tradition, in parts of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is something less than austerity emphasized. Let's just say. I mean, people have heard the phrase tantric sex and so on. What's your now? He was your father's personal teacher. And
mother,
and your father and mother, they both knew him well. What's your take on him and the standard critiques?
Yeah. I mean, so it's he was 9. I mean, I was 9 years old when he died. So a couple things. He did go through early life, a very austere training from very early childhood because he was recognized in this Lama tradition. So he had definitely been through those rigorous disciplines, and he did not observe a lot of the boundaries that, for example, for me, some of those boundaries as a teacher make a lot of sense, and he didn't observe a lot of them. There was a high degree of transparency, so that does that usually I think when people really get themselves into trouble is when they say they're doing one thing and they're doing another, and there have been a few controversies in the Buddhist community, Tibetan, Zen, and otherwise recently that have really had that quality to them, that there was a non-transparency. So I definitely respect that. I don't know that he would have been my teacher because but he also didn't stay around very long, so for me to even study with him. So I do relate to him as a lineage figure. I find his teachings very helpful. He does have a kind of artistic and poetic being, a kind of fearlessness about being who he was. Being a person who could have just as easily been regarded as in our racist society as like from a third world country, became this highly revered with a group of Western students. I also think, the genocide in his country must have affected his state of mind in some way. I mean, we don't often analyze Buddhist teachers in terms of trauma survivors, but it seems like that would make a lot of sense. So I'm really interested in the idea of an imperfect humanity that still awakens, and so that's the way I look to him. But in terms of defending his actions, or attacking them as being hedonistic or gluttonous, I mean, I stick with his teachings primarily, and again, he's not my main teacher. His son, who's a very different type of person, is. His son is a person in the world. Every once in a while, I've seen him drink one beer, or that's about the most I've ever seen. He has a family. He has a great wife. He has 3 daughters. So it's a much more kind of conventional, non-austere life that I'm attracted to. But I do think that there's a lot of different models of awakening that are possible.
Okay. Well, certainly an important figure. I mean, if you see Buddhism as coming to America in 3 waves, kind of Zen and Tibetan and kind of Theravada Vipassana, he was at the front of that second wave, and he founded Naropa University, right, in Boulder, which may still be the only accredited Buddhist university in the United States. I don't know. We've got a lot more we could talk about, but I know you have to be out of here by the top of the hour, which is approaching. So maybe you can come back and we'll talk more about Buddhism generally. But
I would love that, and I just also wanted to say thank you, Bob, for writing a book that's so scientifically and spiritually relevant in 2017 that actually doesn't avoid the word Buddhism in the title. You could have written like the science of mindfulness or something.
One thing it can't be accused of is avoiding the word Buddhism in the title.
Yeah.
But thank you very much. That means a lot because I know you know more about a lot of this stuff than I do. And on the other hand, I know you're a very generous person, so I should probably discount for that. In any event, this is a cool, really, really beautiful little book, The Dharma of the Princess Bride, What the Coolest Fairy Tale of Our Time Can Teach Us About Buddhism and Relationships. Ethan Nichtern. And, people should take this as the occasion to watch the movie again. I think it's $3.99 on Netflix or on something that I watched it on. And they should watch it and then read the book.
Yeah.
Make a week of it.
That's good.
So thanks so much, and I hope we'll talk down the road.